Okay, we are up to page 3, or at least I am, of the first quiz. You may or may not see a video of page 2 because I just apparently hit the wrong button or something and spent however long going through it only to find it wasn't recording, which was not very bright of me. So we'll see if I have enough patience to go back on that. But I did want to point out on 13, 14, and 15, before I get into actually working these problems, that the basic rule is the absolute value of a complex number. And it doesn't have to be a plus in the middle. Remember, B could be whatever. It could be positive or negative. The absolute value of a complex number is defined as the distance that number is away from the origin when you graph it. So that becomes like a distance formula problem or a Pythagorean theorem problem. And since when we graph it, we go A, left or right, A tells us how far to go left or right, and B tells us how far to go up or down, then this is what happens. It's like Pythagorean theorem. It's A squared plus B squared and the square root of it. So that is the definition of the absolute value of a complex number. So on number 13, when I'm asked to find the absolute value of negative 7 minus 4i, my A here is negative 7, my B is negative 4, and my absolute value is going to be the square root of negative 7 squared plus negative 4 squared, which is the square root of 49 plus 16, which is the square root of 65. And that does not simplify, so I'm done. Same thing here. This is my A, this is my B. So my absolute value is the square root of 1/2 squared plus 1/2 squared. 1/2 squared is 1/4. 1 over 2 times 1 over 2 is 1 over 4. So this is 1/4 plus 1/4. That is 2/4, which is 1/2. But remember, you cannot leave a radical in the denominator. So we won't. This is square root of 1 over square root of 2, and to get that out of the denominator, I'm going to multiply by square root of 2 on top and on bottom here. Remember that a square root of 1 is just 1. So on top I have 1 times square root of 2, and on the bottom, square root of 2 times square root of 2 is just 2. And that is my answer. Okay, on this one, this is like A plus BI, where A is 0. So my absolute value is 0 squared, which we don't really have to write, plus negative 3 squared. Okay, when we square negative 3, we get 9. Square root of 9 is 3. It doesn't matter that this was a negative 3. This is going to be a positive 3 because it's describing a distance. You cannot have a negative number distance away from 0, 0 in my complex number plane. Or, yeah. That was 13, 14, 15. On to 16, 17, etc. Something that not everyone was careful of on your quiz. If there is a number, or a number, if there's anything between parentheses, then we're not multiplying. To multiply two sets of parentheses together, this is what you see in the middle. Okay? This is not multiplication, and this is not multiplication. This is subtraction, this is addition. So the only thing I have to be really careful of here, like for instance, let's do 17 first. On 17, these are just grouping symbols. They're not telling me to multiply. There's nothing to multiply times. If there was like a little 2 here behind the plus 2 times this, that would be maybe distributive property. Or, there'd be other things you could do that would require multiplication, but there's nothing here that's requiring multiplication. So this is just grouping symbols. It's saying this complex number plus this complex number. So it means exactly the same thing if I had written it as if I had written it with no parentheses whatsoever. The only difference between this and this is that this minus does mean something in the middle. When you have a minus in the middle, that means the same thing as if you had this. So you have to put on the brakes and take the time to figure out how that sign is going to affect things. So this is negative 1 times negative 5, that's a positive 5. Negative 1 times negative 4i, that's positive 4i. So we have 8 minus I plus 5 plus 4I. How do I know it's plus here? Because it was positive 5. So now I'm combining my like terms, which is what addition and subtraction means. It means combining your like terms. They're the same thing. Negative 1I, positive 4I, it's negative 1 plus 4, it's 3. So that is the answer for 16. 17. Like I said, it's just the same as if there were no parentheses. I'm combining my like terms. Negative 6 plus 1 is negative 5. Negative 1I plus 3I is 2I. You always want to try to remember to write these in standard form, which means the real part comes first and the imaginary part comes second. Okay, so put the imaginary part at the end of the expression. Number 18. Remember that you're not allowed to have radicals in your denominator. So if you do have radicals in the denominator, you have to do something about it. I is a radical. Remember, it stands for the square root of negative 1. So I have to get rid of that radical in my denominator. This is the whole reason we learn what the complex conjugate is because in order to do that, I'm going to multiply by the complex conjugate on top and on bottom. Sometimes people say, why don't you just square it? Because if I square something, I have changed its value. Multiplying by a number over itself is the same thing as multiplying by 1. I haven't changed the value of this if I do that. I'm just changing the way it's written. Okay, so on top, this means I have negative 3 plus 7I times 1 minus 8I. So I'm going to multiply that out. Negative 3 times 1 is negative 3. Negative 3 times negative 8I is positive 24I. 7I times 1 is 7I. 7I times negative 8I is negative 56I squared. Okay? I squared automatically every single time you see it happen turns into a negative 1. So this is negative 56 times negative 1, which is positive 56. So I have negative 3 and positive 56. That's going to be 53. Then I have 24 I's and 7 more I's. That's 31 I's. And that is my answer for the, excuse me, I was calling it the answer and circling it. It's just the top part. It's just what happens in the numerator. Now, we have to do what happens in the denominator.
Jacob
Another
Boys,
beautiful
please come to
announcement.
the main office. Jacob Boys, please
1
come to the
times
main
1
office.
is 1. 1 times negative 8I. 1 times positive 8I. This is why we multiplied by what we did, because these two are going to cancel, and 8 times negative 8I times negative 8I is going to make negative 64 I squared. I squared turns into a negative 1, so this whole thing becomes a positive 64. So I have positive 1, positive 64, that's positive 65. So this was my numerator, this is my denominator, and so I have as my final answer 53 plus 31I over 65. Next, all I'm doing on this one is multiplying. This one's much easier. It's basically like half the last one. So I'm multiplying it out. Negative 4 times 8 is negative 32. Negative 4 times 2I is negative 8I. Negative 9 times 8, negative 9I times 8 is negative 72I. Negative 9I times 2I is negative 18I squared. I squared turns to negative 1, so that's going to be a positive 18 back here. Negative 32. If you got 50, you kept this negative. If you got a 50 in your answer. Negative 32 plus, because it's positive, 18 is negative 14. So negative 14 minus 80I, because that's what happens when you put negative 8 and negative 72 together. That was page 3.